All right, GM. Hope everybody's having themselves a good Tuesday. It is that time again. I'm so excited to be here. I've got a great show ahead for you today. But you are tuning into Color Commentary, where art and alpha collide. It is 7 p.m. Eastern time. We do this show every single week, same time, same place, same channel, same everything. And I hope that you will continue to join us for it. We have an exciting show ahead, guys. We've got Nix.eth coming in. We've got takeaways to share from last week's big special edition collab with RD called Work in Progress. We're going to break it all down for you, but if you can do me one quick solid before we get started, drop into that lower right-hand corner, give the space a reshare, drop into the DMs for a couple of your friends, let them know we're out here doing the damn thing, and we're going to get things started here shortly. We got to set a vibe first, right? That's what we do every single week. Let's start off with a little bit of music, get things straight, and get our friends up on stage with us, shall we? This is Buddy.
Me and my buddy, we making all of this money. Yeah, I know it's rude to be bragging. They never catching us lacking. Me and my buddy, we working hard for this money. You know I've been in my bag, yeah. Buddy, I got it like that, yeah. Y'all better stop. Me and my boy gon' climb to the top. Sidekick game like Calvin and Hobbes. Batman and Rob. Y'all know me, I'm down for the cause.
Y'all know us, we start the party. Go way back like Doc and Marty. Either die legend like John Lennon or end up solo like Paul McCartney. Let's go.
W's only, there's obvious signs.
Looking around me, it's hard to deny.
I mean, just look at the audience size.
Well, robbing you blind like Bonnie and Clyde.
Y'all do too much just to fit in.
Zach and Cody, we stay twinning.
Sweet life only, we stay winning.
Been this way since the beginning.
Me and my buddy, we making all of this money. Yeah, I know it's rude to be bragging. They never catching us lacking. Me and my buddy, we working hard for this money. You know I've been in my bag, yeah. Buddy, I got it like that.
Yo, my greatest idols are all-time rivals. I'm talking Biggie and Pac.
Yeah, every room that I walk into, it's like all I hear is applause.
Hey, I don't need to just roll solo. I got a buddy like Han Solo. Yeah. I'm in the money, I rock polo.
I never bomb sets, I just bomb photos. Yeah. Like boom, lights, camera, action. Do a big boy, I'm talking Miss Jackson.
Right. Bury those beats, yeah, I'm feeling like Braxton. Good Jewish boy, cause I always pay taxes.
I've been on a mission, got a blast.
Feel like Jimmy Neutron with the raps.
Why you always living in the past?
Let me give you something that'll last.
Me and my buddy, we making all of this money. Yeah, I know it's rude to be bragging. They never catching us lacking. Me and my buddy, we working hard for this money. You know I've been in my bag, yeah. Buddy, I got it like that. Me and my buddy, yeah, we never need to understudy. Did it independent, we don't ever need nobody's money. Everybody calling me, they said they wanted something from me. Put me on a song, all of a sudden they be running from me.
Running from me like we playing good cop, bad cop. Crowd going crazy like it's Woodstock, can't stop. Every show I'm playing be like new girl, pants drop. Work way too hard, you're never gonna see the man flow.
All right, ladies and gents, appreciate you coming through. My name is Stephen Miller. You're listening to Color Commentary, where art and alpha collide. Got a big show ahead, guys. Appreciate you coming through. It is another Tuesday, 7 p.m. Eastern. That's when we do this show every single week. Got a big one ahead. We got a lot to recap from last week. Definitely got to do a little bit of housekeeping while we're here, though. So right up front, just so that you guys are very well aware of what we do here, this is a show where we basically deep dive with a little bit of an art feature. We typically like to feature 2 to 3 artists on each show. We got one today for you. That is Nix.eth, the creator of Hexagons. But we also do cover a ton of other stuff, right? We talk drops. We talk about what's going on in the market. And last week was absolutely no exception. We had a phenomenal set of interviews lined up. But then RD and I teamed up for a little space that we decided to call Work in Progress. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later on in the show, because I really do want to dive a little bit deeper into kind of like what the data has been showing us, what this first 6 months of the year has really, I guess, been for us, right? What it's set up. And there is a lot that it has set up. So please do stick around for later on in the show. It's going to be a lot of fun diving into that. But I would be remiss to not remind you that Color Commentary is part of the Daily Alpha's partner network of spaces. You can check out the TDA Tuesday through Friday at 10:45 a.m. Eastern Time and Saturdays at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. You will probably see them here in the show in a little bit. Bring them up as our co-host every single week. But the TDA is home for us, and we appreciate them infinitely. So if you're tuning in as part of the TDA fam, TDA or stay poor is the motto. Let's dive on into some other quick housekeeping. So if you've not yet kept up with our drop calendar and what we publish every single Monday, We publish All Eyes on Art. It is a digest that covers the week ahead and the coming 30 days. Do check that out. It's pinned to the top. A lot of great drops on deck this week, but also give you a little bit of a picture into what's coming ahead. So, also, we've got a big thread coming in the next couple of days. It'll be a follow-up to what we're going to be talking about a little bit later on in the show in terms of recapping work in progress. So do keep an eye out. Make sure you're following, and you will get that as soon as it drops. Again, it is going to be a beast to work through all of that, but I cannot wait to share it with you. Just a ton of insights in it. So let's go ahead and dive on into things as I always do with these interviews. Whenever we're featuring an artist here on Color Commentary, I like to make sure that I paint a little picture for you, our listener, right up front so you can get right into the mix with us and we can cut right into the meat of what's going on with this drop. So tonight, I am joined by Justin Colland, also known by his pseudonym Nix.eth. Justin is a longtime technical founder who made his way to Web3 in 2021 with one goal in mind: to help usher in a better future for our modern internet. In the years since, he discovered that blockchains are not too different from a traditional canvas. It's as much about code, community, storytelling, and even economics. So, after years of tinkering with algorithmic art, Justin took the leap and released his first generative collection, Triangles, last November. His genesis was eye-opening. It funded the planting of 5,000 trees around the world and showed that creative endeavors can indeed lead to a real public good. Having proven that his artwork can serve the goal that brought him to Web3 in the first place, Justin is leaning in, now preparing to debut his latest collection, Hexagons, this Thursday. From its instantly recognizable aesthetics to its thoughtfully crafted lore, the collection explores humanity's reliance on cryptography and what can be communicated through intentionally minimal compositions. I don't know about you, but I cannot wait for this interview to take shape. So, Justin, welcome to Color Commentary. How are you doing?
Doing great, Stephen. Thank you so much. That was a hell of an introduction. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely. We're absolutely stoked to have you on. Obviously, I try to get pretty damn comprehensive with our introductions here, but what else should our listeners know about you before we dive too much further in?
Yeah, I think you covered it very well. You took away all my talking points. No, yeah, I started my career. So I just turned 40 this year. And like all my early career was, as a tech founder, as an entrepreneur, as a product guy. I didn't really start following this artistic arc or allowing myself to be more artistic in my creativity until really last year. And I think Web3 had a very powerful impact that I wasn't expecting when I pivoted into it, and sort of um, I guess supporting me and encouraging me to follow a bit more of that in myself. Like you can only go to, so many conferences, so many meetups, so many groups, talk to so many artists, collect so many artists without getting that, some of that rubbing off and getting that bug a bit yourself. So I'm just really grateful to be here and to be empowered to explore these different things and try different things. And yeah, I'm excited about the future. I'm excited about Hexagons coming up. I've put a lot of work into it. I'm a little bit nervous. Like it's the last week now, dropping on Thursday, so there's definitely some nerves there around all the mechanics and if everything works right and goes right. But I think yeah, I'm excited.
I was gonna say there's a ton to be excited for with it, and I mean we're gonna cut up every single little bit of what's going on behind the scenes. We're gonna tell a little bit of the story here, but there is no shortage of interesting angles, like all the puns intended, right? There's a lot of different angles and ways to view this project, and I think the easiest way for us to kind of start out is by taking what we know about it, what you shared publicly, which you can find pinned to the top of the space, and really get into the inspiration behind it first. So, what exactly inspired you to make this collection? Because it's deep. You've got everything from like actually properly crafted lore, which is for some reason still kind of a rarity here in generative art, but you've crafted real lore into this drop. You've got deep sets of palettes. You've got an angle on this for it being an alternative PFP. So all these things considered, like what inspired you to do this in the first place?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's also one that I struggle a bit with answering. But I'll give it my best shot. So I guess that's similar to the question of like, what's your creative process? What inspired this? And I feel like, my creative process is more along the lines of like not setting out with a specific goal and just, trying things out. Like, I think for me personally, a big part of it is like granting myself that permission to just try things just for the sake of like having them in me and wanting to get them out and seeing where that goes. And that's probably in contrast to, most of my early career, which, is creativity coming from a different place, but it runs more through a filter of business, right? Because it's like you're building tech products, you're building tech startups, you're every idea you have, every thought you have, even if it's really cool and really fun and is sort of a piece of your soul, you're then running it through a filter of like, how does this fit into a business model? How can I sell this? So for me, it was more of like the process now is just giving myself permission, being like, just create something because you want to create it and because you have it in you and you want to get that out. So on that kind of takes the form of like starting with code. Like I'm definitely a coder, a software engineer, and like meditating on different concepts. So specifically with hexagons, I was really exploring and thinking a lot about this idea of random entropy, of like randomness. Like, what is randomness in a physics sense, in a technical sense, and and what will that look like sort of in the future realm of quantum computing and the different tech advancements we have kind of coming down the road, and we're building so much of the future now on crypto, right? Like we have like everything we're doing here, everything blockchains, everything NFTs is all on a foundation of crypto. And some of the other ideas that kind of went into that, which I was playing around with at the same time, so this has been over about a 6-month period, was also the PFP angle, like you mentioned. Like I really thought for myself personally, like I wanted to rock a PFP that wasn't character based. After a few years of like character based PFPs, I started to to get a little bit old of it. And just for myself, I was like going through my art collection, like all the generative art I've collected, all of it that I love, and trying different ones like out as PFPs and like seeing how it felt. And like I didn't feel like most generative art collections really worked as profile pictures. And there's not even a lot of examples of like the artist taking the approach of thinking about it from a PFP perspective. I think there's some exceptions to that. Chromie squiggles, like we see a lot of people rocking Chromie squiggles as PFPs, especially in the generative art artist and collector sort of circles. So I think that there's some exceptions to that, but mostly overall, and it's hard because when you think about it from a PFP angle, you have to think about like, how does it look at a really low resolution? Is there enough variety at that low resolution? How does it look in a circle crop? PFPs are cropped into a circle in most places. Um, Other angles that kind of came into the inspiration for hexagons, one was a bunch of sort of prototype algorithms I've been playing with, which were, let me see, I'll try to keep this like somewhat PG, but we're like exploring like visions I'd had like using entheogens over the years. And how I could communicate sort of some of those feelings and visuals in a in an artistic way, and in a I guess in an ineffable way, but in a way that could be expressed to others. So I was playing around with, obviously that leads to like a lot of geometry. So playing around with different geometries, different geometry layouts, how they work with each other, how they influence each other, different palettes, different colors, these type of things, and kind of the final like inspiration for hexagon specifically was like, since I've been around NFTs 2021 or so, I really had like a lot of ideas that I kind of just been filling in notebooks around like what NFTs could do, like different, I really think of the blockchain as a medium, the blockchain as a canvas, like what are the different perspectives that or the different mechanics we can use in NFTs and crypto that we can't do in conventional art. And I've been filling notebooks with these. I some of those probably here might not know it, but like when I started in Web3, I decided to join Horizon Labs Ventures. So I was kind of one of the founding employees of Horizon Labs Ventures, and I worked with a bunch of like more like PFP utility community blue chip type projects. And I've also been supporting different artists behind the scenes and helping them with their tech side and stuff like that. So I had all these ideas that I've been building up, and I didn't know how to really go about using those. And I wanted like a larger project, which is why I'm calling this like a generative project and not a generative art collection. And the reason being is it's sort of intentionally going to be my platform for experimenting with different different mechanics or different approaches to what can be done with generative art and what can be done with collections on chain and off chain. So it's kind of my playground in that sense.
So it's really interesting. There's a lot of things that we're going to unpack from what you just told us, but I think the thing that I want to tap into first up front is the fact that there is an identity when you enter into some of these collections that have the degree of minimalism where it's like, okay, the composition is primarily made up of like shapes, but there's unique style to each and every one, right? You brought up Chromie Squiggle, and I think that there's an interesting comp to be made there. A lot of people don't know this about squiggles, but like it's literally just a bunch of overlapping circles. Like people don't like they don't have that context because they're not looking down into the code or they haven't done like a ton of deep research. But when you talk about a collection like that, it is very I don't want to like minimize it because it's an incredible collection, especially for what Snowfur has done for the space. But it is like a very shining example of what can be achieved through a minimalist generative space. So when I look at what you've done with hexagons here, like it does bear a handful of like those similar minimalist constructs and hallmarks, right? So when I think about the potential of using something like this as a signature, right? Because like when you talk about identity in this space, yeah, I mean you kind of default to PFPs, but there's a lot of people out there that think of their identity as their signature, and you could very easily see something like a hexagon piece being a signature, just the same way that every person out there within the Squiggle DAO uses their Chromie Squiggle as their signature on all their emails and stuff. So like there's a really interesting layer about like how this can be perceived as identity. And it's really cool to me that you're actually differentiating it from generative art in terms of like thinking of it as a generative project versus a generative artwork. But what I wanted to kind of turn to now is the fact that there's a really, really interesting layer to this where you've crafted a deep amount of lore, right? And there's a ton that goes into that. And I think for what you've done here, it tells a much bigger story. So would you mind kind of breaking down the lore element of all this for our audience just so they can understand how keys connect to it and how you're thinking about the quantum elements all tie in? Because I think that would be really important to unpack.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that. I was trying to scroll through and find something to pin up for that. Um, yeah. So when I started off, like as this project started to take shape, there was so much of it that I felt like if I tried to communicate it in like an explanatory way, it would feel boring and kind of dull. And my path to creating it was really diving into this world and this idea of what would like what would cryptography look like in the face of quantum computing? What does decentralization mean to humanity? Which for me, it's very, very important. I'll try not to go off too far on a tangent on that. But and also like what this idea of there being intelligence at levels that isn't ours, right? So like if you say like from the quantum realm, which is just a very blanket statement, right? To say quantum realm, it could really mean a lot of different things to different people through different perspectives. But like if there was intelligence that existed somewhere like that, how would it communicate? What would its message be? What form would that communication take? So a lot of that ended up being like I actually ended up writing. In a past life, like I thought I was going to be a writer, so I used to write a lot of more like hard science fiction type stuff. So I ended up with actually quite a long like kind of this lore like story behind hexagons. And the first people I showed that to were like, this is way too long. Like this is like mini novel length. Like nobody's gonna get that deep into it. I don't think you're gonna have a lot of overlap between the type of people that are collecting generative art and people that are be interested in reading something like this. So I pared it down over the months and got it down to just like 10 sequences or 11 sequences with pictures. If you go to hexagons.art and you click on documentation, there's lore right there. And I hired an illustrator to work through the illustrations on it and to illustrate it out to kind of go along with it. But it just follows the story of like a group that wants to research basically threats to cryptography, which is synonymous to threats to humanity as far as decentralization and the centralization of these new powers. They're developing these things. They recognize that they need better quantum random. They need better random data, so they turn to quantum random data, and they find some pattern in that, right? That they don't understand. So they try to like filter out this pattern. Where's this noise coming from? There shouldn't be patterns in this kind of data. Like data taken from the quantum realm should be extremely random. And they end up finding they end up discovering it's this visual language, which is the hexagons, and includes some other things too. You mentioned the key. I can go into that in a little bit, but also like names, like each hexagon has a name, and there's a bunch of other things maybe in there to be discovered. And it kind of ends in this place of like, they wanted to spread these hexagons and these keys out to as many people as possible to sort of put the hands into the power of humanity, the power of people, rather than like holding it to themselves and trying to use it to control and to have power over people, like other groups may do. And what's cool about this lore is it really follows, obviously I didn't discover an alien race hiding inside of quantum signals somewhere, but like it does follow what my thought process was, and my meditation was exploring the idea of randomness, because I had reached out to the Australian National University. They have a quantum optics lab, and they've been playing with like extracting quantum random data from, I guess, like vacuum fluctuations. I'm not a scientist, but like fluctuations in a vacuum on the quantum level. And they provide that data to different businesses and different people. And, I asked them, like, can I use your name? Can I use data? All that. They were totally okay with it. Like use all of that. So, I am using, like, for the mint, I'm kind of calling it like quantum form, which maybe is a bit cheesy, but like, it's this idea of like long form generative art, which I love. And, for those that might not be familiar, like long form art is something, long form generative art is something that NFTs really enabled, which was the ability to create digital generative art that had certain characteristics, such as not being curated. In the past, like a lot of generative art was curated, where the artist would generate a whole bunch, pick out some really good ones, and then sell those, put those online, whatever they're going to do with those. With long form generative art, you have this concept of just putting the algorithm actually on chain, and then when people mint it, you get an output from it, and the artist has no idea what those outputs are going to look like. The collector that's minting them has no idea what they're going to look like. That's something I'm really passionate about. I took that and added in sort of my own perspective from this angle of hexagons, where I'm combining that that blockchain data that's created by the mint, and combining it with actual live quantum random data coming from ANU's science lab, when I seed basically the algorithm that creates the final artwork and it reveals. So the lore kind of follows, in a way, the process I took as I thought and built the project, and what went into it, what creative ideas went into that.
It's really interesting the way that you explain it, because I think that a lot of society wants to think that they understand the idea behind like quantum computing and like how that's actually going to drive impact. And then they also live in this world of Web3 where cryptography is just so central that it's really easy to think that you understand it. But when I read through your lore and I kind of dive into the fact that like you're conceptualizing it in a really unique way here, it makes it kind of like all the more compelling. So just to make sure that everybody out there is well aware of it, yes, you can check out some of the visuals up at the top of our space right now. Make sure that we pinned a bunch of that up for you so you can have some visual reference points. But also, if you do have the time, go to hexagons.art, because the documentation that Nix has put out here for this, whether you're just talking about like the general about section or really diving into like all of these different layers of documentation, is, I mean, dude, it's absolutely fucking thorough. And yes, I'm leaning hard away from the PG when I'm saying that, but like the level of thoroughness that you've built into the storytelling behind this, the infinite levels of why, is next level, like entirely. So while I'm just going to kind of let that be the momentary flower giving, right? I do want to kind of turn the page here a little over to what you brought up with like perceived patterns despite randomness. What is it that you kind of have put into place here to ensure that all of these outputs are really going to look distinct from one another? Because I think that, you can speak a lot to that through traits and palettes, but I'm curious about what your thinking was when you were defining that.
Yeah, so great question. One of the things that I'm excited about in the future of art NFTs is I still feel like there's a lot for us to explore. And a lot of that has to do, especially in the generative side, I feel like it has to do with this idea that an algorithm is something that can live and modify and combine with others in a similar fashion to like how we look at today, how we look at like open source software. And a lot of like the products we use today, even right now here on X, I bet it's probably 1,000 different open source packages mashed together, talking with each other, working with each other to come up with something great, which is this ability to have these live spaces, across the world in voice. So when I released Triangles in last November, it was I was really kind of pleasantly surprised by the amount of different artists and even programmers that took the data, because I this on chain approach, like on chain, like actually on chain, is really exciting to me. And so with Triangles, I'd put all of the data on Ethereum, like all of the individual like geometric points for the geometry, the triangles that make up the pieces on chain. And there was actually this different artists that took that, and they took all that data and made different things out of it. They were like, hey, I took all of these and I reimagined it and I made this. And like, oh, what if you rearrange them, all these triangles this way? Or even just basic things like finding cool patterns and like counting how many times my algorithm had used different colors or different sizes or different angles, and just these kind of things, which really excited me coming from a software background, because it kind of felt like that open source realm. So when I approached hexagons from the beginning, I thought, as I'm building the algorithm from the ground up, I'm actually going to build it more like I would approach building a software package. So I actually started with building an SDK that creates this artwork like my PFP is showing here. You can go to hexagons.art, and like the main homepage is a big, just infinite generation. You can wait for them, or you can click if you're impatient and just cycle through them. They generate forever. It's actually like this SDK. And then what feeds the SDK is this key. So when you're minting, you're actually minting this key. It's 45 characters long, and it's this data format that holds all of, I guess, like the traits or knobs you would have in traditional generative art. So we could call those traits like a color palette, and or spacing, or all the different aspects that would be traits, are all held in this key that's only 45 characters long. And this key goes into the SDK, or this key could be used manually. Somebody could decode it. It's I have a section on the website kind of breaking down how that format looks. And the key goes into that SDK, and that's actually what outputs the final artwork that we're seeing when we mint, or we're seeing as examples. What's cool about that is that then empowers me and other creators to use those same keys through that same SDK, but come up with different interpretations of it. So maybe that's not even hexagon shaped. Maybe it's a completely different pattern, but it's because it's coming from that key and through the SDK, it maintains that progressive or iterative feel. So maybe it maintains the same palette, or if one key happens to come out more spaced, like there's more negative space than others, then it keeps that feel. And I've actually explored that already. Like I've been working with a couple producers on like generative cell phone cases. So you could like take that key, you can use that same SDK, but you can come up with something that's even though you can kind of feel it came from that original NFT, it can adapt to a different format. So it could be more busy, or it could cover a different size of area, right? And my X feed has some examples of this, and the NFT itself is interactive and actually comes with a bunch of these reinterpretations, like cell phone backgrounds, Zoom backgrounds, different cards, stuff like that. And those all come from that same SDK with that same key. It's just using it in a slightly different way. And I don't know if that got like too technical, but I guess the really like TLDR way to put that is I built this from the ground up, thinking about the future of iteration and hoping that one, I'm going to be building other things using those same keys, and that it invites other creators to come and maybe use those keys in different ways with that SDK as well, to come up with different things. So trying to empower and sort of inject more energy into that magic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense to me. And just for everybody in the audience to know, if you have questions or if it did not make sense to you, feel free to raise a hand and come up. Like, this is a very open stage. I'm more than confident that Nix would welcome your questions if you'd like to come up and ask any. But I do actually want to tap into a more dangerous question in line with what you were just saying. So if you would mind going down a little bit more of a risky path with me for a second, I kind of want to get your opinion on something. There's been a really interesting set of debates lately, amongst like the generative art community, especially about the reuse of existing code, and that's like the types of like code that you can find out there in repos or GitHub, repositories for specific experiments within the generative scene. Do you find that like there's a certain layer of call it artistic integrity, right? That gets stripped away by just utilizing other people's code bases for generative work? Or do you think that like there's actually a really healthy jumping off point? And did that sort of conversation inspire you to share this like SDK type of thinking with the rest of the world?
Yeah, that's such a good question. That's going to that's a dangerous one. That's a bit of a minefield depending on who you're talking to. Um, for me, like my perspective, which doesn't come from, more of a traditional art background, is I grew up around like Web 1, I was already in business kind of early Web 2, really thinking about how we were going to build the future of the internet. And we went through a lot of these very similar conversations, right? So if we look at like how code was being used pre like open source movement, it was a lot of like very stringent, protective copyright, obfuscating, closed source, patenting a lot of this, and open source wasn't really a thing, and it was seen as very negative if you borrowed, in quotes, any code from something that already existed, right? And that if that similar to what you're seeing now, I think in generative art, it's like, oh my gosh, I found out this person used this piece of code. And although that still exists, in more of like the software open source world, it became like everybody kind of settled in this what I think is a very beautiful place of like, one, it's kind of, I guess, like customs and how you do it. So there's a lot of structure in place with like how you host a repository, how you add a license to it, how that license is recognized, and now it's not even thought twice to just do, with a few keyboard strokes, like, if you're working in JavaScript, it's like npm install some package name, and then you just imported, thousands of lines of code into your project, and you just use it and move forward. And there's, your compiler is going to take all those licenses and stick them all together so that later if somebody else looks at the code, they can see a license from the person that created that package, earlier on. And I think it really fed like a huge boom in what we're capable of, right? Like I love the Isaac Newton quote, like, if I've seen further, it's by standing on the shoulder of giants. Like, I don't think nothing any of us does is original, right? Like, it's maybe a piece of originality from us, but we're building on others. And even if you're saying like, oh, I'm a generative artist, like I never used a single piece of code offline. Even if that's true, like you're using things like JavaScript that took a lot of people a lot of years to build into what it is today, and it empowers you and gives you the ability to do that. If you had to start from scratch with like stones and sticks and not even electricity or computers and try to build, a generative art project today, you wouldn't be able to finish it in a lifetime. Like no single person could do that. So I think that, as the space matures, it will probably lead more towards what we see in open source software. It'll lead more towards like, hey, I'm Nix. I'm voting that my algorithm is open source. I'm, all maybe there's been some attempts at this in the past, but like different ways to attach licenses on chain to NFTs and code, to show that license. And we did that a little bit with contracts, right? When we put smart contracts on chain, and when we deploy them and we verify the source code, we usually attach some sort of license to the top of it, right? Which gives others that are looking at it this idea of, what the original creator intended for the code to be used, and if they're okay with you using it. It's There is of course always those gray areas, right? Like there's the gray area of like, maybe I'm working on something really cool and I'm like, man, how did Eric, like how did Snowfro do that in Chrome Squiggles? Like I want to check this out. And being, that it's long form generative, the code's there. Like anybody can get to the code. It's not protected behind some wall. So you can go, you can go look at it and play with it. And maybe you're like, oh, that's how he did it. Is one line of code or two lines of code? Maybe it's like how he handled looping through something. Is that okay to copy and paste? Like, or getting that off of a website or getting that off of a Stack Overflow answer? Or, I mean, I don't even want to touch on AI because that's just opening a whole other can of worms, but like, or asking, AI for that. Is that, wrong? And like, where does that line come about? Right. Like there's obviously a place that line is hard for most people. Like if I took, you know, Eric's Comey Squiggles exact JavaScript and just changed like the color palette and re-released it on, a different blockchain and called it something else. I mean, that's probably a hard red line. I think most people would agree with that. But I think some of the arguments we're seeing now, or some of the debates we're seeing now, are more, it's more nuanced, and I think it's a little blurrier of when are you crossing that line. And I think as maybe that'll even in some ways become more of a debate, because as the space matures, you're also going to see more like copy paste libraries that are intended to be that. I mean, this is what we saw with the explosion of like rich media in Web 2. When we saw things like Flash, like you could work in Flash, you could come up with everything from scratch, or you could go spend $200, get a library, and make a couple clicks, and you had all these things that you didn't have to do yourself. And we'll probably see more of that, and we're seeing that now, right? I know what you're referring to, and it's a couple debates around like using code off of tutorials on websites that are teaching generative art. So maybe I'm a bit kind of all over the map on that, but I think it's a good debate, and I would I would personally love to see it move in a progressive, in a positive direction of more like, hey, this is actually really cool that people can iterate and riff off of things and combine things. I'd love to see more like generative artists even get together and being like collabs where it's like collabing off someone else's algorithm and adding something to it or changing it. That's something I hope to see with my own work, and I hope to see more in the space and less like um, name calling or like judgment over using different pieces, because we're seeing the same things in AI. Like it's very similar parallels, right? Like, oh, you didn't make that, you used AI. Well, you didn't make that, use it partially a tutorial. Like I don't know. I'm happy
Yeah,
to.
no, you're
Yeah.
you're definitely on the you're on the track that I was trying to set for you. And I think that it's really fascinating listening to that dialogue take shape over the last couple of months, especially because like there's a group of very hardline thinkers, but at the same time, like there's a wide spectrum of like what is acceptable, right? What amount of code that somebody else wrote can you actually integrate and make your own by tweaking and, just turning dials and stuff, right? You brought up the AI example, and I think that that's a extremely nuanced conversation on its own. But I told you right from the jump, right? Like that, it's a dangerous question to kind of venture into, and I appreciate you kind of entertaining it for a little bit because it's the entire discussion around open sourcing code, especially in the generative art world, is going to be a very complicated discussion going forward. There's just no two ways around it. So, getting the chance to hear your perspective on it, thinking about how others will use hexagons in the future is actually a really compelling lens to look at it all through. So I appreciate you taking that little diversion with us. I'm going to go ahead and hard left turn us back toward hexagons for a second here because I do want to point out one last detail of it and then kind of dive into some more like call it just explorations of how this connects to like your prior work. So the one final question that I did have for you on the collection itself is why was it so important to you to build out this 95 palette repo of honorary palettes? Because I think it's really interesting that you phrased it as honorary. And I know that it calls out to a bunch of different developers over time and individuals in the space and even historic figures. Why was that so important to you? Why was it central to the project?
Yeah, I think you built it up a little bit. Like some of it was laziness. No, when I started on this, like I knew back to that PFP angle as I was experimenting, I knew I really had to like leverage as much as I could um, the variables that would make a bigger collection look distinctively different if you're trying to keep it so aesthetically simple, right, to fit into like a PFP. And so the different things like that are like how you lay out the grid, and a big one's palettes, like how you use color, right? So I knew there was going to be a lot of palettes, and I started by like building some of the palettes by hand. Then I started trying to use some code to like take my palettes and like come up with riffs on them. Like I'm not a like a color specialist, so using code for me helps like come up with palettes where the colors match each other and like they feel good, and and exploring those things. So I think I started with a few hundred palettes, and it was just this exhaustive process of like months. And my family actually is so tired of hexagons and palettes because like every single day I was like projecting on the TV. I was like, it's palette time. Like, let's go through all these palettes. Like, which ones do you love? Which ones do you hate? Why? And when we got it down to 100, then it was like, now it's naming time. Like, we need to name all these palettes. And so we printed them all out. And like, for a few weeks, it was sitting around the house. We were drawing on it. We were coming up with different names. Even like my 12-year-old daughter was coming up with them. And a lot of them, like the name just kind of instantly was like, oh, that's the name to this palette, of course. Then there was, so finally there was 95 palettes, and there was 15 of them, which I had a hard time like coming up with specific names for that kind of felt like it matched the colors. And one day I was sitting around, and I was playing with it, and I was actually reading about the history of cryptography, and like the history of like geometry, and like the uses of things like hexagons in theory and construction, stuff like that. And so I was, of course, looking into a lot of like prominent figures of the past, and I thought like, holy cow, I'm going to take these 15s, make them eponyms, like make them honorary palettes, give them names of like people that I think were badass. Like most of them are more like crypto punk pioneers, and some of them go even further back than that in technology and math. So that's how those names came about. So it was a bit laziness. Like I couldn't come up with a name that fit them. And then I was like, this is a really cool way to like pay, a little bit of an ode, like to pay a little bit of respect to all of those, giants' shoulders that I'm standing on, and that we have to thank for the foundation that we're building all this on today. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I think that when you get into this conversation around honorary, right? Like what is the essence of the tribute, right? Like it's a really interesting thing to kind of dissect, because when you talk about it with one person, it can be a very different reason and rationale from another. When I look at what you did with yours, it is really, really core to the actual story of the collection, as opposed to like, oh, I'm just going to do a bunch of honoraries that, acknowledge the names of people that are core to my life or core to my story who have made me who I am today. Because there is such a deeply steeped lore behind this collection that you've written, it made a ton of sense for you to like actually name palettes or name certain elements of the collection to honor individuals within cryptography, within computing history. I mean, you mentioned in the list there, like there's, Alan Turing in the mix. Like there's a lot to it. And when I get really nerdy about this shit, right, the way that I have been this entire conversation, and I appreciate you entertaining it, for the audience to just kind of understand, it's not every day that you run into a collection that so clearly has a ton of thought that's poured into it. And like there's varying levels of it, but I'm going to point you back again to the documentation that Nix wrote out for this, because up at hexagons.art, like it may well be one of the most comprehensive, well written documentation series behind a generative art project. And granted, I understand the fact that you see it as a generative system and you see it more as a generative project versus generative art, because you have treated it as such with your documentation. So it is a really interesting mix, and it definitely captured my attention. So I appreciate all that you poured into it. There is something I did want to dig back into historically, and I think that it is an interesting comparison. So with what you did here with hexagons, right, considering the minimal aesthetic, the naming conventions, do you find that like the way you went about this specific drop is something of a departure from the style that you employed in triangles? Because like it's, at least from where I sit, obviously like there's shaping that is very clear. Like you're trying to zero in on certain poly shapes, but like I equivalent triangles as something of like low poly style, whereas with this I see it as kind of different. So I mean, do you find it as a departure, or do you find it more as like an evolution?
I think a little bit of both. Like they're very similar when you look at them as, vector art, right? And or algorithmic art, like using algorithms to build art, using code, using vectors, is really, really intriguing to me. Like I would say it's a huge part of my style because I've always felt like it has this like essence, this quality of being like more than the pixels, right? Like it's like you see the pixels on a screen or the dots on a printout, but having like math behind that and a more of a vector approach is something I've always just been fascinated by. So triangles was it was like a genetic algorithm that I built from scratch. The choice of triangles and it, I think, really made sense. It gave it, like you said, this low poly sort of feel, which I think for me is exciting because like I love styles that give just enough like suggestion to like tease out some recognition from like the mind of like, oh, that's a beautiful landscape and a tree, even though it's just a handful of triangles, right? And like I feel like the way your mind like projects different things on top of that that aren't there is exciting. And I don't know exactly how to define that. I'm sure um somebody with more of like an art history background could probably use some specific words there, but that's also something I brought into hexagons. Like it is vector based. Like it's being built through code. It's a grid of vectors. It's a little bit different. Like it's not a genetic algorithm like the triangles was, but I still feel like it's an evolution and sort of in that same realm. And this is only my second collection. Like I'm relatively new on this artist arc and exploring this. So I feel like my style probably has even more to still explore. But I don't think it's a departure. And like in the future, like I plan on focusing on this project for a while. But in the future, like I definitely see more of the triangle aesthetic coming back because even when I'm taking breaks from hexagons and sometimes you'll see me post them on X, like, and it kind of comes back more to that feel and style which I love and I kind of think in. So does that answer your question? Oh no, I wonder if I dropped off. Can someone give me some thumbs up if they hear me?
Oh, of course I'm speaking to the mic. Don't mind me.
Oh,
Um,
okay, sorry.
I know I appreciate you saying that because that's the first time on this show. I used to have, dude, I used to have such a bad habit of this back at like a year and a half or two ago when I was hosting this at a different spaces. I had such a bad habit of talking to the mute button. um, I feel like I'm revisiting that nightmare. So I appreciate you kind of bringing me back to reality there for a sec. You answered the question beautifully. Let's get back on track here, right? Um, I'm always fascinated by the why behind why it is that styles change from release to release, especially if you're like in the early artistic days of any given artist in terms of what they choose to release. It's just an interesting insight into the journey, and hearing that why from your perspective is actually very enlightening, not just to me, but I know for a handful of the artists who are in the audience. I have to imagine that it's eye-opening to them as well. So I think it's an incredibly authentic thing to dive into, and I appreciate you taking it apart for a sec there. I had one last question for you that kind of relates back to triangles, but then we're going to go down a completely different lane. And I appreciate you kind of rolling with the punches here, because it's going to be much more heavily debated when we talk about this next set of topics. And I suspect that we're going to probably have a couple people from the audience that want to come to stage, and I would encourage them to come to stage to take part in that conversation, because it's going to be a lot of fun. At least from where I sit, I'm a nerd. What do I know? The one question that I had that relates back to triangles really ties back to public good. And I'm curious, because you made such a point with triangles to make it so that it had a larger impact that stretched beyond the chain with planting trees around the world. Is there going to be like some public good tie-in with hexagons, or did you just see this as, looking at it more from like a classic SDK approach as opposed to trying to make it about giving back?
There absolutely will be. It's just something that hasn't like clicked and felt right yet. With triangles, as I went into that, my crypto journey kind of started, at least my like rebirth into crypto and Ethereum and Web3 was really in like public goods. So I started like focusing on DAOs that were in public goods, UBI trials, proof of humanity, like a lot of these different public goods ideas. And with triangles, I was really excited because it was trees. It kind of felt obvious to me. Like I love trees. I love the physical world. I'm a hiker. Like I love getting outside. I want more people to touch grass, and I want to show like more examples of bridging this like crazy metaverse we're building with like our actual physical space and taking care of it. So with triangles, it made a lot of sense, and part of that, like the tech exploration in that, was building a bridge that actually worked with a partner, which was ecology. And when somebody minted, it like called ecology, paid for like the funding of planting trees, and then inscribed back on chain through like transient lab story inscriptions protocol back to the NFT, like proof that that was paid for and that that happened, and used kind of the minter's name as this like permanent receipt, like I guess like flex. I don't know, just like this. I thought it was this cool dynamic to try to bring like some good on chain, and it worked really well. I think it was exciting, and like you mentioned, it funded the planting of 5,000 trees across, I think it was like 22 projects in total across the globe. And I really like, it's one of the things I'm the most proud of triangles. Like the fact that it caught on, like it was popular and a bunch of people wanted to collect it and did, was really exciting to me and really satisfying. But even more so, the fact that like it did this good in the world was amazing. And with hexagons, everything I do in the future will definitely have that angle. And with hexagons, like I didn't just want to reuse that same mechanic, which was the tree planting. I actually, have been exploring, like I went down this bee kind of hole, because it was like this bee rabbit hole, because it was hexagon shapes. Like obviously honeybees and bee combs are like one of the most prominent examples of hexagons being used. So, what public good can be done around different like bees? Like, are there charities working with them? Are there things like that? So I've kind of vetted some of them. None of them have really felt yet like, oh my gosh, that's the thing. So I didn't let it hold up like getting it out there, but there will be that angle. It'll be something. So there will be, just it hasn't felt like it's the right thing yet. If that if that's okay to say.
No, and it is. I think it's one of those things where like the right thing will snap into place eventually, right? Like you'll find the right meaningful attachment. And I think that it can be said of a lot of your work so far, right? That it needs to be a cohesive story from start to finish. If it's going to have a tie-in, it needs to have meaning. It has to have attachment. So like when I was thinking about how it wasn't stated currently, I mean, my brain immediately, turned toward that of bees and like looking at that as like a potential good that you could benefit with part of the proceed. But I also thought to myself, okay, like if he's trying to view this from like a quantum computing angle and really looking at this for, the SDK of it all, like you could easily also make the case that like a really great attached, cause would be that of like teaching kids to code, right? Like that's another really, comprehensive, compelling angle for how this could all tie together. But at the end of the day, I know the right thing will snap into place for you, and I'm excited to see what that is. So that leads me again down to this fun angle of a different sort that I want to talk about, and it's the base of it all. You're launching this collection on base via OpenSea drops. There's a couple pieces to that I think are really gonna eat at some of the members of our audience, and one of the members of our audience, I'm not going to tell you who because I refuse to call them out, albeit that they're in my DMs. Um, See, they specifically made note that they're bummed that this isn't on ordinals, and that like this sort of thing would be absolutely perfect, for Bitcoin. And I find myself kind of thinking to myself as you're like reading your story and getting familiar with your background of how you became captivated by Bitcoin in 2012 after reading the Cryptonomicon, like it kind of becomes a very pressing or present question on my mind is like, why was it that you chose base for this as opposed to rolling something like this out on Bitcoin when Bitcoin's a really big part of your history in the space?
Yeah, that's a good one. That's definitely if there's any if there's any drama point to this project, it is that, right? It's this idea of chains, and it's become even more even on the art side, right? With ordinals, like there's been so much good going on there. It's become a bit of a contentious point, but I guess there's really kind of the way I think about that is sort of broken down into three questions, and it's like the first question is like why Ethereum as the L1, versus something like ordinals. I think that's probably for an artist like that's probably the two premium, right? Ordinals or Ethereum. The second question kind of being like why an L2 then? Like if you decide on Ethereum, then why an L2? And the third being like why base specifically is an L2. So, the first like why Ethereum, I think crypto art is really an extension of the principles found in like conventional or even digital art. Like I think of it as I always like to say blockchains as a canvas. Like it's about the code, it's about community storytelling, the different mechanics, even economics. I know it's something a lot of creators don't like to talk about is the economic side of it, but it is there where it's a very economically driven space. So I think that like even each art piece or each collection kind of has a soul of its own. Like I started really thinking hexagons was going to be an ordinals collection. Like that's the path I went down for months. I actually set up a full node. Like I wrote all the original code like in JavaScript. I had it all using recursion, using different even some novel approaches to kind of how you can use that. The concept of keys, the concept of names. Each hexagon NFT having a unique generated name versus having an incremental ID like you see in ERC 721s came out of ordinals when I was researching. And I'm like, why do people still use incremental IDs? IDs aren't really a technical requirement. So a lot of the energy came through that. And at the time, like I had been, of course, meeting with like BD at Magic Eden. I had been talking with some of the, kind of the movers in the ordinal space and the art space. And I really thought it was going to be that way for months. But again, back to being like, I feel like each collection or each piece has its own sort of soul. And there were, as it unfolded and as it grew, there were certain aspects that kind of hexagons was demanding that didn't make sense on ordinals. A big one of those being ordinals, I think is I feel like hexagons wanted to be a big affordable collection. Like a lot of people said I was crazy for shooting for 10K. It's mint's only going to be for 5 days. It's going to be up to 10K. But I just felt like the energy of like the message I was trying to tell, the mechanics, the things I had planned for it in the future, it wanted to be a much bigger collection. And I'm really excited about like more inclusively priced collections. And one of the things with ordinals, and I love it. There's so many artists doing great things on ordinals, and I'll probably do something on ordinals in the future. Is that it's more expensive, right? So you get into this realm of like it costs more to make bigger collections on there. And although there are some big collections, a lot of the community itself is more in the lane of like smaller collections that are priced more mid to the high range. And again, I'm not downing that because I think that each piece has a choice to have these different paths to follow. But as that started to unfold with hexagons, I felt like it was going to be a choice of either being more limited, um, more expensive, and a much smaller collection size on ordinals, and just running all those tests and all those generations. It just didn't feel right once you got under like 1,000 or a couple thousand pieces. It didn't feel like, I feel like the beauty of the collection as a whole is through a lot of generations, especially when those generations are seen together. Again, like 95 pallets. Like if you have, 1,000, that's only 10 of each pallet. So that's something I felt like I was going to have to sacrifice if I wanted to stick to ordinals. And that's why I made the decision to go on Ethereum. So that was kind of question one, like why Ethereum versus ordinals. And the second point kind of was then why an L2, and the third being why the L2 of base. I don't know if you want me to continue into those, or you want to stop kind of on that first one and discuss that.
So I do want to go into the third because I think that as much as we could talk about like the why L2 of it all, I think the bigger question really is why base, and it will inherently answer why L2. But I do want to give you a ton of credit to the reason and rationale for why not ordinals there, because I think that within the larger ordinals community right now, there is a really big, ongoing conversation about how the artwork needs to be super intentional and like built very intentionally for Bitcoin, instead of just simply deployed, right? As like, this is my art and I only want to drop it on Bitcoin. Like a lot of people think that isn't a good enough reason. There should be story behind it. And I'm not sure exactly where I fit on the spectrum for that right now. Like, jury's still out a little bit in my own mind, but it is just as important of a question to ask when you're talking about deploying art elsewhere. And that's why I bring it up. But the idea of launching this on base or launching it on another ETH2, I think, and you can speak to this in a second for sure, and I think that it probably was a consideration of yours, is the fact that over on ETH and on L2s, you have the ability to use engines. And for long form generative projects like this, you need an engine. You need software that can actually facilitate the randomness generation and trying to actually provide a key that can create a completely unique random output. Over on ordinals, like there are starting to become more engines kind of in the mix, but as of right now, like there is no staple, there is no standard or benchmark for how, creative engines are going to be a part of that discussion. Everything over there right now, for the most part, with generative art is still very much so about co-curation or about bringing in a curator to help determine, the small supply of a collection out, as opposed to finding a way to make it random. Of course, that is starting to vary a little bit. I'm not going to get into the finer detail of that, but it does kind of bring us back around to the base of it all. Why did it make sense for you to drop this on base as opposed to any of the other L2s? Was it just kind of like where you're seeing more artists release work right now? Is that kind of the vibe of it, or was there something more intentional about it?
It was more intentional for sure, and I agree with you on the ordinals thing. Like, it's actually, ordinals is an incredibly good platform for generative artists. Like, it's really cool because I'll try to say this in a way that doesn't like step on the toes of ETH generative art lovers, because I'm a huge ETH generative art collector, but like it does like really embrace fully on chain, like really living on Bitcoin, generating on Bitcoin, into its core sort of identity, which is great for generative artists. And it actually avoids a lot of the cost issues you run into with generative art, because you can use recursion, you can reuse these things. So I think we'll see a lot of premium generative art on ordinals in the future. Like I think we'll see that. And a lot of the libraries, I mean, are very interchangeable, because we're talking higher level on the stack, we're talking JavaScript. And the bread and butter of ordinals is JavaScript, right? Like when it comes to the recursion into generative art. Whereas on, Ethereum, you're not running JavaScript on chain, right? You're serving something, and maybe JavaScript runs in the browser. And of course, on ordinals, the JavaScript's not actually running on chain either, but it does, its DNA is like this really 100% on chain sort of DNA, and I love that. Um, Engines, yes, of course. I would kind of group that into tooling. Like there's a lot more tooling available in the Ethereum ecosystem just because it's been around longer, right? So you have things like, like Art Blocks engine. You could go to, you might not be like, I don't know how they're curating anymore, but you might not be, curated by Art Blocks, but like you can go to prohibition.art and like deploy something using the Art Blocks engine and P5JS like with a few clicks, and it's open and accessible to everybody, and it's there. Um, there's still some ways for that to go on ordinals, but that can also be a bit of a plus, right? Like friction can be good in some ways, right? Like not making it so easy that you just get overrun by it. I think friction can be a positive. It's why we're seeing, I think, some of the more serious art drops on Bitcoin is because you have a little bit more friction in collecting and trading, which can be a pro. I'll try not to get too far on that, but yes. So tooling and engines for sure. In general, like that wasn't as much of a consideration for me because I wrote everything from the ground up. So I didn't use any engine. I didn't use any library like P5 or anything like that. I did everything from scratch. And so it wasn't as much of a concern to me. And also embracing the on-chain ethos wasn't as big of a concern to me because this is very aesthetically simple art. So I can fit it on chain cost effectively kind of anywhere. Like it doesn't demand a lot of storage space that more complex algorithms and processes would, right? So that's also something that wasn't as big of a consideration for me. Why base, or like I can kind of group that together, like why an L2? I think, philosophically, like I believe the Ethereum fees were a bottleneck to adoption in the last bull. Like I feel like the accessibility due to fees was kind of limited how big the NFT or art movement grew during the bull market. And some people may disagree on that, but like we all remember, spending $20 to transfer something or mint something, or even thousands if you look at things like other side. So I think that fee, those fees were a reason that it didn't gain even more traction as it could have. And, you know, being kind of, let me think of how to put that. Like, so yes, so I believe it's that. And there's a lot of risk to an L2 than from like the creator, builder, or artist side too, because you go with an L2, you're automatically seen as like cheaper, or it's like mainnet rules. That's where all liquidity is. I don't collect anything unless it's on mainnet. Is sort of a lot of the vibes, and we still see that today. So there is risk to like choosing an L2, but I feel like a lot more artists and builders need to take that leap before we go back into a bull adoption cycle again, just so that we've empowered all those different developments that'll enable like fast, cheap, layers on top of Ethereum. And then like specifically like why base? Like I think base stood out to me for a few reasons, and I this was very intentional. Like I spent a lot of time thinking about different L2s, talking to teams, exploring, and I think for me specifically, base is unique in a few ways. I think one is inclusivity, and I say that from the perspective of like the team itself is uber focused on making the chain like mainstream usable. They're putting a lot of effort into things like the new wallet, the type of things they're funding, the type of things they're trying to give energy to, are really focused on like how do we bring this crypto stuff to a billion people. And for me, from like an NFT art, I'm way more excited about like art for a billion people than like art for a few thousand. So that part of like kind of their ethos is exciting to me, which other L2s may not be approaching in the same way. I think a second big reason is trust, and that's probably like the most the most loaded a reason you can give is trust. Like I'm a crypto OG, like pre 2012, Bitcoin, and like the word trust is almost bad. It's like no, it's trustless. Like everything's trustless. We don't need trust, and it's not really the reality. Like the reality is trust is important, especially early on in the inception of things. And if we look at the things that have taken hold and become the standards in blockchains, in crypto, in NFTs, it's been things that started from a trusted place, with a trusted group. When I started kind of in crypto, like when Coinbase came around, I really disliked Coinbase. I was like, screw Coinbase, man, that's the worst. Like centralized wallets, like if you don't, if it's not your wallet, you don't own it. And all those things are true, but I didn't see like I didn't see them as being a positive force. And I actually, I won't go too far into this, but like a funny story of like 2015, I actually wrote an article like really like bashing them for their approaches to Bitcoin. And Fred like emailed me and basically like offered me a job. He's like, why don't you come to Coinbase and do a difference? And I actually ended up going out and like meeting him and Brian. This was, I think it was December or November 2015, and like talking to them and having like hearing from them in person, like what their vision was for crypto, for Bitcoin at the time. And it was Bitcoin was like it, right? For Bitcoin for the future, really made a lot of sense. And I feel like it was a maturing moment for me where I started to recognize more of this dance of, you know, of moving from a centralized world to a decentralized world, and how important it is to have some trust in the beginning as we release the reins to those things and sort of move them on. And I feel like Coinbase did, they said those things, and then I feel like they did a pretty good job at following through with them. Like they did take us out of like, I remember trading on like BTCE. It was like this shady like Russian exchange where like your bank account would get frozen every other withdrawal, or Mount Gox, like trading like it really did bring a lot of legitimacy to Bitcoin in the States. They were important figures in like lobbying and getting licenses in states and sort of laying that groundwork for a lot of the things we take for granted now in crypto today. And I feel like their actions did speak to that. With Base, I see as I talk, you know, to them, you know, not to Brian directly, I'm not close to him like that, but like to different people there and to people that are being attracted to it, I see sort of that same ethos. It's like it's a really balanced, mature sort of perspective on like what an L2 can be and what the path can be to making a really solid, you know, optimistic, you know, roll up L2 and bringing it to the mainstream. So trust, I think, was a big part of that. And then you mentioned like who's releasing on it. I think vibes is also a big part of it. Like, you know, I love the people that have been dropping on it. Like it's attracted, you know, this goes back to the team again. Like they've, the things that they've been funding, the things that they've been giving attention to, vibe well with like how I see the future of a decentralized blockchain based, you know, humanity. So, and that's not like putting down other L2s, because I actually love the fact that we can have cultural expansion in different areas through different L2s that focus on different things, because we've seen other L2s focused on a very, very different set of crypto use cases and products. And, you know, with Base, you're seeing them attract, you know, you've got like Xcopy doing an edition, right? Like that's huge. You're seeing, you know, a lot of, you know, through the hackathons and stuff, like a lot of the products being focused on, the services being focused on, you know, the non-NFT ones, just vibe well with, you know, what I see. And finally, I'll add on that, like, I think it's worth noting, like, Optimism's amazing. Like, I'm a crypto nerd. I think Optimism has done a really good job approaching scaling of Ethereum. You know, for those that aren't aware, like Base is built on the OP stack. So it is, you know, it is Optimism, it's Base. And I feel like, you know, Optimism and Base are kind of going to be the NFT winners. And, you know, again, like not to discourage other chains or people that are excited about other chains, you should be. But that's something I do think they'll kind of win that. And again, there's risk to that. Like there's always risk to being, I don't know what to use an example, like Polygon. Like there was a period where Polygon was kind of a hot thing, right? And a lot of people were, a lot of different artists were trying out Polygon and minting things on Polygon, especially up and coming artists. And I feel like a lot of that energy kind of died off. So there is that, I think, that risk. But for me, that risk was worth taking to be a part of moving the needle forward in a direction that I want to see the NFT needle move towards.
I love how, like, at this stage of the game where we're at in the space, I'm having to double check my mute button every single time now, since I brought back the F up. But I think that your point is really well said. The idea of art at scale is something that we're seeing just explored constantly, right? And I think that as we start to see more chains become present fixtures within the art scene, it's going to be really interesting how, like, they end up becoming perceived, right? I think that you can make the case that, like, Ethereum, art for the established, right? Solana, art for the degenerate. Base, art for the masses, is kind of like what they're taking up. And you can lump in Tezos and say art for the asses on that, just to do my one shot per show at Tezos artists and the Tezos blockchain itself. But the bigger point here is that it's okay to release art on different chains. Like, you should be thinking about the intention behind it. You should be thinking about what the opportunity is for one chain versus the other. What, strengths does one chain have over a different one? Does the, narrative that you're trying to craft for your work, does it fit on that chain? And also, does it meet other, qualifications? Like, does it actually maintain permanence? And is it as immutable as you would like it to be? Right? All those things have a role. And it's a question for each individual artist, what is most important? So I think that you answered that entirely there. But I want to make sure that as we're now just past the hour, that we call back to the drop itself and make sure everybody's on the same page for it. If you have any questions, again, raise your hand. I'm going to bring some folks up to stage here shortly. But to remind everybody who might be interested in picking up hexagons of their own, the drop is Thursday, the 27th. It's happening over on OpenSea on base. It's a max allotment of 10,000 pieces. You have a 24-hour allow list starting at 11 a.m. Eastern on Thursday for 0.008 ETH, and then it'll go public at 11 a.m. Eastern the following day for 0.01.
I'll correct you a little bit on that. I think that's yeah, I think you got that from some very, very early. You've been following this since like the very early days, I can tell. It had slightly changed some weeks ago, so it is Thursday the 27th. It's the allow list window is going to be 4 hours long. So at 8 Pacific, so I guess that's is that 11? Is that 11 Eastern? Will be the allow list. There's a countdown on hexagons that art, so it's easy to work through time zones. It'll be 4 hours long, and then it'll go into a public mint. So that same day at noon Pacific time, max collection size of 10K, 0.01 ETH, and then that public mint will go on for 5 days until July 2nd, or until it reaches 10,000 collection size, and then the reveal will also happen on July 2nd in the morning or in the afternoon, so noon Pacific time again. Does that make sense? Do you want me to repeat that?
So it made perfect sense to me. I hope that the audience follows it, just as well. It seems very easy. So you've got a 4-hour allow list starting at 8 a.m. Pacific, 11 a.m. Eastern, and that will be running for 4 hours until 12 p.m. Pacific. I'm having to do math on the fly in my head with time zones, and I hate it. 3 p.m. Eastern. So that's all good. I did just figure out what it was that caused that mishap on my end. The OpenSea drop page cached a prior version of what you had, so that's why it was sideways. So no sweat. Glad we could clarify that here, because it was in the digest as it used to be. So either way, if you're on the allow list, it's 0.008. If you get it in the public window, it's 0.01. Honestly, guys, like, I think it's a great collection to go mint. The entry point is really accessible, and I applaud you for making it so thoughtful in that regard as well. Because if you were dropping on base and you're not making your release accessible, I'm not really sure why you would want to do that at this stage of the game. So I applaud the fact that you were thoughtful about that. But I think that is just going to about wrap everything up, man. I dove super deep with you on this. I normally don't dive this deep on my interviews. Normally it's like a 30-minute feature or 40-minute feature, and then we run. But I loved it. I thought it was a great conversation. I appreciate you taking the time to come out and chat about it. Is there any other final notes that you'd like to leave the audience with about the release, so that we can kind of leave them on the right note?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, safety is important. Like, this will be only minted on OpenSea. That's the only place with the wallet connect. It's a verified collection. Like, don't get don't get scammed. So just OpenSea. It'll on mint day, it'll be right on the homepage and everything like that. So be careful there. Safety is important, and I really hope, like, people who even are Ethereum maxis or ordinal maxis. I really still hope you'll participate and join me sort of in this generative art journey. You'll also build a mint with a credit card through MoonPay on OpenSea. So if you really don't want to even have Ethereum on base or Ethereum, you can even mint with the credit card to hold it. So Yeah, that's it. Thank you so much. It was a deep dive. Like I sweated a little bit on some of those questions, which I love, and I really appreciate the time there, Stephen.
Of course. Again, guys, the drop is called Hexagons. It's from Nix.eth. I hope you'll check it out on Thursday. Feel free to stick around. I'll come back around at the end of the show for final thoughts from all of our speakers on stage, like we do. But this show normally does run about 90 minutes, guys. Sometimes we go over to about 120. Just based on my estimate right now, I think we're probably going to go about 10 over today, just to kind of take a couple minutes to rediscuss work in progress and all that. But we did have another member of our audience who wanted to jump on stage, and I imagine may have a question for you, Nick. So I do want to toss it over to this gentleman from our audience who joined us on stage. That is going to be Chris X51. Chris, do you happen to have a question for Nix?
Oh, I've got. Hello, guys. Yeah, I've got lots of questions, but I was kind of. I just like listening to you guys. Yeah, everything that you come out with, and I jump from space to space to space to space, and yeah. But rather than me ask a question, somebody asked me a question.
What did you think of the, what you were hearing about hexagons? Is this the type of art collection that you would actually collect?
What I really loved about the hexagon, because when I went into yours, was, that middle O, where it was like a moon, in the actual thing, where you've done your thing. That's what I loved. I loved things like that. Just that thing. Because that's what floated my boat.
Beautiful. Well,
so, and I really, really did. But it's going to be a full moon here. Yeah, I used to be a werewolf, but I'm all right now. But yeah, I did like that.
Good. Well, I'm glad, Chris. Well, look, feel free to stick around. We are going to dive into some other stuff right now that was kind of on our agenda for today. But if you do have any other questions, feel free to cut.
Agenda?
So we're going to be recapping a little bit that we discussed from last week's special feature space, which is called Work in Progress. Now, again, feel free to raise your hand. We'll bring you back up in a little bit if you do have any questions about it. But I am not going to just kind of go back and forth and ask questions of you on this space. We've got a little bit of an intentional agenda here. So I do want to dive into a little bit of a recap just to kind of quickly take you guys back through it if you were able to join us. I appreciate you taking the time. If you weren't, perfectly fine. I will be actually putting out a pretty lengthy post later on this week, really wrapping things up. But I did want to kind of take just a minute here to give you a macro level view, right? 1,000 level view of what we actually dug into in that space and why taking the time to look at the last 6 months is just so freaking important when you're in Web3. And so often you get a viewpoint where it's like what's in front of you is most pressing at any given moment, right? Like we always are chasing alpha. We're always chasing the next drop. And realistically, if you want to set yourself up for the future, like it's not about the old saying of like, it may not repeat itself, but history may not repeat itself, but it often rhymes, right? We're not talking about that even. We're talking about what is it that we've seen across the last 6-month interval that will inform the next set of trends. That was really what that space was meant to be about. But what we ultimately got into a lot deeper was looking at what artists actually need right now. What is missing in the larger, dialogue of where generative art, where digital art, where AI art, where all of digital right now actually is. We didn't quite get into stuff like the biggest opportunities, like uncut gems, like looking at specific drops. We didn't necessarily get into answering the big questions that morons like Beanie want to bring up, like, is art a Ponzi? Spoiler alert, it's not a Ponzi. But we got into things like, what's working for artists, right? One of the things that's not working right now is we do need to absolutely provide more resources for artists. It's been a really big talking point ever since that space. I've heard it on a number of other spaces. And it brings up the question like, okay, like what does that look like? What is a resource? And my argument that I think needs to actually be part of the larger conversation is we need more artists who are willing to actually better support other artists. It's not necessarily like, opening up free marketing resources. That would be great. But I think that at the very core, artists want to feel seen, right? And they want to feel seen beyond the sale, right? It's not just about the financialization of art. It's about the actual creation, what went into it, the part of your soul that you bear when you create, right? That is what really does need to be seen. And it'll mature the conversation around digital art if we do allow ourselves to get into it. But we need to stop letting it trend in a less inclusive direction. That needs to change. We need to make sure that more people are part of this dialogue. That's what this show is partly about, right? It's about getting different viewpoints in so we can all become better informed digital art collectors, curators, artists ourselves, right? Like all of those different art professionals within our broader community, they need to be a part of it, right? We need to continue to support one another. So that was one of the bigger core points that we got back from artist feedback. But there was no shortage of great conversations around the trends of the first half, right? We saw a lot of multi-chain experimentation in the first half of this year, right? It wasn't necessarily that like it's the first time we've seen multi-chain art, but we've seen a real modern attempt at meeting the collector where they are. And that's something that should be paid attention to, because I think that as we go forward, there's going to be that accessibility conversation. It's not going to be art limited to one chain on a given collection. We're going to see an individual collection that's minted across a number of different chains simply to meet the collector where they are. It's an interesting sign. There's also a lot of maturation to the way that exhibitions and group shows are currently being planned and executed. So when I talk about these things and I bring them to your attention right now in this recap, it's about figuring out, okay, look at the broader pulse. What is it that we can do for each other? What is it that we can do ourselves? And how can we best prepare for what's coming down the pipeline, right? So when later on this week, I drop this entire thread, be on the lookout for it, because I think that there's going to be a lot of really, really important takeaways on the what's working and what's not, what really needs to be watched out for if you are an artist, if you are a collector, if you are a gallerist, if you are a curator, so that you can stay ahead of the curve and you can stay relevant in the conversation. We talk so much about attention economy over here. This is the type of shit that you need to be keyed into, because otherwise you're not going to be able to maintain that attention. You're not going to be able to maintain your consistent, finger on the pulse of the market. And that doesn't matter what your role is. It applies to you. So I would implore you, keep an eye out for it. That one's going to be very interesting to kind of dissect. But in addition to that, one of the things that I did want to bring up here today that I didn't get a chance to bring up on that space is the actual data. There was some really interesting findings, because for those that are aware or not, I am a compulsive data tracker. So when it comes to the posts that I put out, I'm constantly monitoring certain trends within them. And because All Eyes on Art, that weekly digest I publish, has been released weekly in its current form since literally January 4th, I've had the opportunity to track what our market is actually doing, these fluctuations and drop counts, what it really looks like on a monthly versus a weekly scale. How have certain things that have happened to our market affected the populace of how many drops occur on a given week? It's been really fascinating to watch. I cannot stress it enough that there's so many really vital takeaways that can be taken away from all of it. And chief among them that I did want to point out on this show is that when you look at the way that the market's progressed throughout this year, it's a positive trend. As much as people want to tell you that the art market right now is bearish and that, not enough drops are selling out, or that it's all slowing down, not so. Not so in the slightest. I think that you have a degree of challenge to what the norm is, but it's not necessarily that we're seeing these massive slides. The only time where we saw an out of character slide in the number of releases that occurred on a given week was in the week following the Bitcoin halving. And I think that was largely to be seen. I think a lot of the drops that we were seeing over on Bitcoin ordinals obviously had to go to a stop because they had to calculate for fees and how that would, affect the broader market. But beyond that point, it was an opportunity for artists to really beckon the question, like, does it make sense for me to drop on ordinals right now? Should I be sticking with the ecosystem that's most comfortable to me? And within the weeks that have transpired since the halving, you see a diversion. It actually is really, really cool to like see it happen in real time. But you go from in April, there being 32 releases on Bitcoin. There were 54 on the Ethereum ecosystem. In May, it fell off down to 10 for Bitcoin. But all of a sudden, you see a massive ramp up in the number of Ethereum releases to 72. So there are correlations that we can find within the data here that I think present really interesting opportunities, a lot of discussion that needs to take place because of it. But more than that, it's about the awareness. It's about asking yourself, okay, do I really know the market the way that I think I know it? Do I need to be better attuned? Am I releasing on the right chain? Why am I releasing on the chain that I'm releasing on? Right? A lot of that can be pulled out and can be extruded from the larger conversation here. The other thing that I did want to mention is the success rates. And I did mention this briefly on Work in Progress. And it's that a lot of times an artist can think about the idea of like really trying to time the market. And the truth is that it doesn't make a damn bit of difference if you look at the way that drops have gone so far this year. When you talk about our most dense month, right? With the month that had the most drops, that month was April. Least drops was January. But if you look at those 2 months in terms of the success rate of the drops that occurred in those months, you're talking about a 3% difference in the rate of success. That's actually staggering. And if you're not aware of why that's staggering, it's because still we have so many people in the market that want to believe that it really does matter that you plan out everything to the date, right? The day of the week needs to be right. No, it doesn't. Your ability to have a successful drop will vary from 12.1% up to 18.1%. That's how this breaks down. So if you are an artist and you're concerned with timing it, don't. Concern yourself with the quality of your drop. The quality of your drop is what's ultimately going to determine whether or not you actually hit a successful release. At the same time, challenge yourself to ask, what does success look like? The way that I measured success over here with this data is unique to me. I was looking specifically at how many of these drops actually met a certain set number of criteria points that I outlined. But success looks different to every single person, especially in the art community. So take the time to think about those things because it's really important. But I am going to leave things right there for you. It's kind of like my little preview, as much as I went into it for like a 10 to 15 minute diatribe there and really monologuing about it. I wanted to point out some of those finer points. But the one thing that I want to leave you with is take the time to find your people. Whether you're a collector, you're a gallerist, you're a curator, you're an artist, find your people. Because ultimately, if you want to talk about the fastest path to success, it's looking at having the right people around you, right? Taking the time to think about like, who are my mentors? Who are the people that I want to build like, right? What is my sounding board? Do I have a circle of trust for constructive criticism before I release? Artists need to be considering a lot of these things. It's really important. So that's just a preview. That's my little monologue to kind of like, bring us out of the show tonight. Again, I have nothing but endless respect and appreciation for Nix for dropping by to give us so much information and dive deep into his project, Hexagons. Really excited for that on Thursday. We will be back next week with another color commentary at 7 p.m. Eastern time. You can mark your calendar. You can set reminders if you'd like, but you can guarantee one thing. We will always be here for you guys on Tuesdays, 7 Eastern. Some final housekeeping before we go. I do want to, of course, remind everybody that color commentary is part of the TDA's partner network of spaces. You can catch the Daily Alpha Tuesday through Friday at 10:45 a.m. Eastern Time and Saturdays at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And you can check out All Eyes on Art, the weekly digest. It's pinned at the top. It's the first post that's pinned, but that will also be found over on nftnow.com. So if you want to just a quick look at the 7-day outlook and then go off into your day, you can find that over on nftnow.com. Last but certainly not least, to everybody that's here right now that's, taking the time out of their day to join us, I appreciate you endlessly. I do this show for you guys and for the art community because there's nothing more important in my book in this world than supporting the artists that, deserve the shine that they don't otherwise get elsewhere. So I appreciate you guys continuing to support the space. We will be back next time for more. Do final thoughts, final words really quick before we go. So I want to toss it back on over to Nix. Nix, any final words that you'd like to leave our audience with this evening before we go off into our night?
Always try to touch some grass, I guess. I look forward to the next spaces. That WIP show with RD last week was so good, man. It was amazing. So looking forward to more of those.
Appreciate that, Nix. It really was a special show, and if you haven't listened to it, strongly recommend going back and playing it back because it was very much so enlightening, especially for artists. So I'm going to leave it there. Again, I've been Stephen Miller. This has been Color Commentary, where art and alpha collide. I will see you next week, 7 p.m. Eastern Time. But until then, keep the vibes real, and I will leave you with a little bit of a song to kind of close us out and send us off in the evening. This will be your moment of Zen.
Here come old fat top, he come grooving slowly. He got juju eyeball, he one holy roller. He got hair down to his knee. Got to be a joker, he just do what you need. Yeah. He wear no shoe shine, he got